Hi, everyone. My name is Akshat Rati, and I'm a reporter with Bloomberg Green. My goal is to try and have a discussion with the three speakers we heard from earlier, Steve, Gideon, and Mark. And we'll have two additional guests on the panel. You've been submitting your questions through Slido, so I'm going to try and get those questions here. And while the guests take our seats, maybe I can say my background a little bit. In an odd way, I started in climate journalism, investigating carbon capture and storage, back 6 years ago. And since then, I've always been interested in the subject. And nowadays, we talk a lot more about carbon removal and greenhouse gas removal than about carbon capture, it seems. But that's one of the questions that I hope we can touch upon. So before I start, you've heard from the three speakers earlier, but we have two additional guests here. Emily Cox, who's a researcher at Oxford University and is responsible for innovation and societal engagement with the Core Hub. And Joe Warner, who's the Deputy Director of Net Zero Frameworks at BEIS, who is responsible for leading policy development on engineered removals. So we'll first hear from them briefly before we get into questions. Emily, do you want to go first?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here launching the GGRD program. And so my particular interest is in the role of society, particularly questions around public attitudes towards carbon removal, and I guess towards innovation in general. And so the name of this session is Taking Stock, right? So I thought it'd be good to reflect on where we're up to. I think in the case of the social sciences, it's worth reminding ourselves of how far we've come. The role of society was ignored, or at best a fringe concern, for quite a long time. I think now we have a much greater appreciation for the importance of society and the importance of non-experts in what we're trying to do here. And our research has advanced, right? And so we now have a pretty good idea of some of the discourses which we're likely to see when we talk to people about carbon removal. And so things like whether it's controllable, whether it's reversible and monitorable, things like whether it's perceived to tamper with nature, the importance of really strong mitigation policy and avoiding mitigation deterrence, and the importance of considerations of justice. At the same time, though, I think there's a little bit of a risk at the moment that the discourse is kind of outpacing the research a little bit. So we know that there are lots of new actors piling into this area. And so how is that going to influence the public discourses? What are the risks associated with hype cycles? I'm kind of interested to notice that there's a bit of an emerging controversy and maybe even some polarization around the concept of net zero. So when I was at the COP in Glasgow, I particularly noticed youth voices rejecting the discourse around net zero. And we've got an opportunity with this project to explore public attitudes and maybe controversies, and to do that at a lot of different spatial scales, which I think is something we haven't done as much in the past. And that's another important step in carbon removal research. But I'm sure you have much more interesting questions than these, so I'll wrap up and move on.
Joe?
Hi, yes, my name is Jo Warner. I'm a Deputy Director in BEIS. And as was said, I'm particularly working on engineered removals. I was going to start by talking about the case for GGRs and what we said, and how that then translated into our ambitions in the net zero strategy that was published in October last year. But I think previous speakers have covered that, so I won't dwell on that. But I'll say very quickly what that means in terms of our policy work and what I think are the kind of three core planks of our policy development work around engineered GGRs. So the first is on business models, which has come up again in a number of the presentations, thinking about what business models engineered GGRs will need in order to deploy at the scale and at the pace that we need them to. That's something we're working very hard on at the moment. We've had a really in-depth piece of economic consultancy work to help us with our thinking on that, and we'll be consulting on proposals this year. The second plank, again, something that's come up in the previous presentations, is on monitoring, reporting and verification, where we need to know that a negative emission is really a negative emission, so that we're both incentivising the right things, but so that we really know that these are doing what they need to in order to help us meet our climate targets. And that's an area, I think, where Cameron right at the start was talking about the international collaboration versus competition, but an area where I think we're keen to understand what the international work is on MRV, because clearly it's important that we do something that is robust and credible, but I think there's lots of advantages too to being consistent with what is happening internationally. And then finally, in the net zero strategy, we set out our sort of longer term vision that greenhouse gas removals should have a place in carbon markets and potentially the UK emissions trading scheme. As many as you might know, there is a call for evidence out at the moment to try to understand more about how that might work in the long term, both for nature-based and engineered greenhouse gas removals. I'll stop there.
That's great. Well, so please keep your questions coming. I don't think I'll get to all of them. We will be going 10 minutes over time just to make sure I can get as many questions as possible. I'll perhaps start with a question I had while I was listening to all the presentations, and maybe Gideon, you can take this one. So you said CCS is not at scale, and I think there's a little bit of a confusion around what we mean by scale. So there's technology readiness levels that we understand, and when something is commercial, it's at 9 or 10 TRL. But CCS has been happening for the past 50 years. What do you mean when you say it's not at scale?
I mean, the scale of removal that we're actually affecting by these technologies. It's not how mature they are as technologies, it's how much we're doing them. And the easiest way of measuring that, of course, is in the tons of carbon that you're removing, the megatons at a national scale or the gigatons internationally. And the only one where I think we can see substantial work being done at the moment is afforestation, where there is significant removal going on in other technologies. They're not yet being pursued at the sort of scale that really makes a difference to our overall carbon budgets, but we need to get them there.
Right. And then one question which is sort of tied to what Joe and both Steve, you talked about, where, Steve, you pointed out the waste framework. I mean, something that we probably all already do is we pay for wastewater treatment. About half of our water bills are typically not for getting the water in the house, but for paying for the treatment of the water that you are ejecting from your homes. Now that's a business model that sort of exists, and you've done some work with the consultancy. What possible business models are we thinking about when we are thinking about scaling greenhouse gas removals? Are there options that are already becoming visible to you?
So there are options. I'm not going to sort of pre-announce what's going to be in the consultation, but if you look at similar technologies that exist, whether it's CCUS, renewables deployment, you can see the kind of frameworks that government employs to incentivise new technologies to come forward. But you might have to just watch this space.
Right. So there's a question from Josh at Carbon Reef who said, how can we ensure that greenhouse gas removals are being used to address hard-to-abate residual emissions and not just emissions that could be easily cut? Is that something you can take, Mark?
Well, that's absolutely important. It's interesting for us, in the previous portfolio, which was only £500 million, only I should say, where we did a lot of innovation, we didn't even do anything with GGRs. We didn't do anything. And I think I mentioned that we've got a £1 billion programme. Only 70 million is going towards GGRs, so there's 930 going towards industry. But absolutely, we're not letting industry off the hook or domestic homes off the hook. We must start abating immediately everywhere. So GGRs is very much the thing that gets us the last mile. I mean, unfortunately, reality is we're going slower than we should be going. Gideon's just referenced on CCS. Yes, we have great plans for CCS, but we're not actually storing carbon in the UK at the moment. So yes, to bridge the gap, there's an opportunity for GGRs, but longer term, it must be the extra mile. So we had a target of 80% by 2050. Now it's net zero. I still passionately believe that we must abate to net zero. So we must keep the original target and use GGRs for negative emissions. So longer term, to start making a proper impact on reducing the carbon dioxide, It doesn't go. So if we go to net zero, in theory, it stays at 420 and then very slowly abates. We need to start being more aggressive than that and try to bring it down, because those kind of levels are far too high.
So you're suggesting there needs to be clarity in how the government is interpreting its net zero goal, where the 2050 target should be really to try and get as close to zero, and then really there should be a negative target that's separate from the...
Yes.
Can I come in on the same question, if that's all right? So I think the way we will have to do it is by being truthful about the cost of GGRs. And if we are really doing MRV properly and proper life cycle analysis, they are, and working out how much they really cost, they are costly ways of dealing with carbon. And if we compete those costly ways of dealing with it with other ways of decarbonising, then I think that's the ultimate way of policing the system. Right. If you can imagine a magical GGR which somehow removed at zero cost and caused no environmental damage and no resource use, then why the hell wouldn't you use it? You would use it and you wouldn't worry so much about decarbonising. We don't have anything like that. All GGRs are quite costly, and that's what will ultimately stop them from replacing decarbonisation.
Now, there's a question from Saran, and I'm going to try and ask this to a non-government guest on the panel. So given the well-conveyed urgency for GGR scale-up, should the government take a stronger leadership in driving definition and standards for GGR, particularly for biochar? And maybe, Steve, you can take this one.
I think that's one area where government does have a really strong role. And I think, as you've heard from Joe and others, that they kind of get that. So the monitoring, reporting and verification piece is largely about defining and standardizing how you measure where the carbon is going and have some level of certainty around that. There's also standards in terms of once you've got those processes in place for monitoring and verifying, what is the quality, what's the minimum bar, or what are you trying to drive to? So for instance, with biomass supply chains, there's still some work to understand those fully and their impacts. But then also you have the work of saying, well, what's going to be acceptable and what's not acceptable? So I think there's a very clear role, and actually that cuts across not just biochar, but several other methods. Although, as you've seen, biomass and the way we use the natural world actually kind of cuts across multiple of these methods. So there are really interesting questions about how we optimize across the multiple things that we could do and we're trying to do here. So I'd say sort of use of biomass and where that comes from is probably one of the key areas for that.
Right. Now, there's a question from Helen, I think, from The Guardian. And the question is, are you optimistic that we have enough time to study these methods and perfect them to scale without any unmanageable detrimental impact, or are we running out of time? Now, there's probably two ways. It'd be nice to have that answer. And maybe, Emily, you can touch upon why this sort of running out of time, you hinted at how young people are having problems with the net zero framework. How does that play into the discussion we're having? And then maybe we can have a technology answer, maybe Gideon or Mark.
Yeah, sure. And I think, this timescale issue is an interesting one because we kind of tend to think of GGRs as this homogenous thing that's going to happen at some point in the future and that's going to take ages to happen. And of course, that's not the case. All of these different proposals we have, some of which are ready at scale today. And so it's about getting that kind of continuous flow through where we're doing as much as we can immediately. And let's not forget in this that one of the quickest things that we can do and one of the most advanced things we can do is have strong mitigation policy, right? And I think one of the things that we find time and time again when we talk to people is that this skepticism of GGR and this skepticism of net zero actually stems from a skepticism that we're really trying as hard as we possibly could to reduce emissions in the first place. And we hear a lot of concerns about perceiving mixed messages coming in. So on the one hand, we're funding GGR, but at the same time, we're also funding high carbon projects elsewhere. When we did our most recent research, that one of the main concerns that came up were things like airport expansion, and people don't see how those scales balance, right? And so I think that there are ways in the near term of addressing these timescale issues. That said, it is something that comes up when we talk to people a lot, that people feel like GGR is almost too fast and too slow. It's being done in a way that's not necessarily sustainable in the very, very long term, but at the same time, people don't perceive it as being ready in time to deal with an extremely urgent climate crisis. And I think those kind of temporal dilemmas are something that we probably need to pay more attention to in our research and also in GGR policy.
Right. And I think the technology side is also a good contextual piece to understand where, solar panels were invented in the 19th century, wind turbines have been around for 60 years in their modern form. Batteries, lithium-ion batteries, 70s again, 50 years to reach scale. Now, Gideon, the question of whether we have time to actually scale them and then also ensure there's an MRV, how do you answer that?
Do you want to do that one or should
Well, I'll have a go at the start. Maybe Gideon can follow up. It can be a double act. So I certainly think it's a very good point. It's very, very challenging. And I think it's up to our generation. I'm hoping Gideon's a few years older than me, but our generation, who ultimately have been responsible for a lot of this problem, myself with Formula One and jet engines, to encourage young people not to get despondent about this. So what I'm concerned about is that people will think, oh, this is too much. We haven't got enough time. What can we do? So we need to give people the advice that we can do stuff, exactly like you've referenced. Constantly, I'm showing people my phone, right? I've quite an old phone, but it still can organize my life, and it's more powerful than the little home computer I used to sit in my bedroom when I was a child. So it just shows the rapid progress we make. So I do believe we can do it, and I do believe we can make progress, but it's really important, which we emphasize in our talks, that we do bring MRV. But I do think scale is possible. So you mentioned about technologies like CCS. So CCS has been done for years, right? But long-term storage in the UK, there's none. It can be done, like our own program sponsored the first at-scale carbon capture plant. It's only 40,000 tons up in Tata Chemicals in Cheshire. It just shows it can be done. So we just need to keep doing it. So I would say it's a case of put one foot in front of the other, and we make progress. Right. This is a big problem, and anything that can have an impact. I'm sure Gideon's going to have a more...
Well, maybe I'll ask you a different twist on that, Gideon.
Well, let me be really quick on that one, and that's just to say that it is going very fast, and I made the point that it's only 6 or 7 years since we really realised the need to do this at Paris. And we've gone far. We now have a commitment in this country of £100 million of spending, and look at the people in the room who are interested in this subject, who are doing the research that will drive it forward. So I think it can be done if we maintain the optimism that Mark has talked about.
Yeah. There's a question from Laura that there's a lot of emphasis on removing CO2, but obviously this program is called greenhouse gas removals, and we didn't really talk about other gas removals. Why? Yeah.
So most of the options that are discussed in the literature and look scalable are CO2 based. So CO2 is the large chunk of it. But I personally think it is really important, the framing of greenhouse gas removal, because there may be other options. Actually, one of the Pathfinder projects that we funded is about methane destruction, and we heard about that in the earlier greenhouse gas from the atmosphere research project yesterday. So there are other options out there. Generally, you're talking about methane, nitrous oxide, and some F gases, the other greenhouse gases that aren't CO2. They're even more dilute in the atmosphere. You talked about CO2 being dilute. So there are real challenges in getting those out, just in terms of the thermodynamics. But I think we should be open to those options as well.
Right. Now, there's a question from Joe, and maybe Joe can take this one, which is that, look, technology falls under BEIS and environment falls under DEFRA, and I live next to a lake in London, which is an amazing privilege to have. We've been trying to get it cleaned up, and we are told there are 5 different agencies that we have to talk to. How does the government come together and tackle this, which is a multi-departmental, not just a multidisciplinary problem, and make sure that it actually works?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I mean, there are always boundaries between teams and departments. I think from where I sit, we do work very closely with DEFRA and across government on this. There are lots of government departments that have an interest. I think I'd go back to the net zero strategy as well, which was very, very clearly a cross-government effort. And if you look at the policies in that, you'll see pretty much every government department is playing its part. That's on a much wider scale. But we are, I think, all very clear that this is a government, it can't just be BEIS, it can't just be DEFRA. It's a cross-government issue that we're tackling together. And as I say, from where I sit, we certainly are doing that, and we're not overly constrained or limited by who's sort of what letter, who sits under which departmental structure.
Now, one other question, which is, I think, very relevant. We've had all these long discussions about years of development needed for technology. There's a question from James Brown asking that, what do you think the current crisis will have an impact on GGR trajectory? That's to do with global commodity prices, inflation, food security debate, and combining it with Alex's question about the anti-net zero push that's happening. There's this sort of like now versus future debate that's always going to be a climate problem, but how do we think the current constraints, which are very real, are going to affect GGR trajectory? Anybody?
It's a tough one.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of how people are going to respond to this stuff, it's a question I get asked all the time. And I think we just need to be really cautious about what we actually know and what we don't know, because there's an assumption out there that things like the current crisis are distracting attention away from climate change, that people care about climate change less. The evidence on that isn't really there. We know that climate change is an ongoing concern of people's. We know that it stayed high throughout the pandemic, despite a lot of hypotheses that the pandemic would shunt climate change off the agenda. And the data just shows that just wasn't the case. And so I think we need to be cautious about making assumptions about what people are thinking and how they're reacting in advance of actually having the data on this. That said, I mean, a just transition is really important, right? And the current situation on people's living standards and on their ability to pay their bills is making the concept of a just transition, I think, a lot more difficult. And it's a major challenge that we're dealing with. And we need to make sure that our efforts to ensure that people can pay their bills this winter and things like that also feed into a coherent policy narrative that is cutting emissions at the same time.
I think it's a fallacy to assume that you should do these things one at a time as well. I mean, clearly we need to have good food security, we need energy security, and we need to deal with the climate transition, and we will have to tackle those together, and there are ways that they can be tackled together. The way that we've seen the shift from wind energy being seen as all about renewables and a climate goal to being an energy security component is one demonstration of how they can be coupled.
Right. Now there's a question from Peter Healy, which brings back memories of uni days when I used to do panels with professors on the guest list. Now, is the program too much science push and rather not enough industry pull? How do you answer that? We heard from a lot of academics, but not enough from industry.
Can I have a crack at that one? So when we designed and allocated the 100 million, we went 70-30. So it's actually a larger component on industry. And the focus of our program, the £70 million program, is very much on industry and getting stuff towards TRL 6-7, which is getting ready for deployment. So we're absolutely, we need both programs. They complement each other, but they're absolutely right. But actually the focus of the government is to get these things deployed. And the hope is that in 2025, when we have the CCS, the storage infrastructure in place and the transport infrastructure in place, that we're able to then start deploying large-scale GGRs to plug into that. So we have a short period to get industry, and they may not be the long-term GGRs that we deploy, but we feel that we can have strong candidates for deployment in 2025, and then longer term there'll be a mature market for the best GGR technologies, and maybe government will be able to step back, and the better performers will because of their better economics, will do better.
And on the GGRD program specifically, I mean, this is a UKRI funded program, so it's publicly funded research. That's just the nature of it. But I think it's a good complement. And also, I mean, we've got 50 plus project partners, so people who are partnering with us in the hub. The demonstrators also have project partners, and quite a few of those are actually in industry. So there's a lot of interest, and we are talking to those people. So that there's space for both.
Now, last question, because I do want to keep us in just the extra 10-minute territory. There was a question which I'm not able to find on the screen here, but how this is, we've talked a lot about UK projects here, but how is this speaking to the rest of the world? There's EU that has its own carbon removal target. There's discussions happening in the US with the DAC hubs. is there crosstalk happening between the UK and other parts of the world where there's GGR discussions?
So on this project, we have project partners who are actually research programs, for instance, in Germany, in the US and other places. Things are changing really rapidly, so things are springing up, but it's a relatively small number of countries that are probably relatively in the lead, of which the UK is one. So we've got a bit of a leadership role on the kind of R&D and on the standard setting, which I think we can make use of. But so we are talking to researchers in other countries. I think this question of MRV, actually, if I was to pick kind of one that would be a great collaboration question, we haven't kind of firmed this up yet, but I think that's a really ripe area. We're also seeing, of course, mission innovation, which is another initiative between national governments, really thinking about carbon removal as well. So that's another forum where researchers can get together with the lead governments to kind of discuss these issues. So this is starting to happen. We're getting a lot of things springing up in parallel, and we're sort of trying to make sure that we can be as coordinated as possible.
Just a quick follow-up there, though. Yeah. CCS has been around for 50 years. There's been standards, because each country where CCS happens has their own standard. Why do you think MRV on carbon removal could be one that we could have a global standard for?
So when it comes to reporting of these things in national inventory specifically, so what are the UK's emissions, what are the US's emissions and stuff, they are set internationally, actually, they're IPCC guidelines. So there's a very clear role for expertise to advise internationally and for international standards. Actually, when it comes to some other things, though, like what feedstocks are we going to use for biochar and how do we apply it, we might have a little bit more leeway to select things that we want to do in the UK ourselves. Now, in terms of building supply chains and businesses and people being able to understand and navigate if they want to play in more than one market, it helps for there to be read across. But there's a mix. There's certainly an area when it comes to national inventories, and there are gaps when it comes to direct air capture, some of these other more innovative methods in terms of how you would actually report those in the UK's inventory, for instance.
Well, I lived up to my promise and did not get to all of your questions. I'm sorry, but thank our guests, and please, refreshments should be outside.